Welcome to another edition of Inside Carolina's Next Level. Well, Greg and I go to the next level on topics relevant today in Carolina athletics. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, johnnytshirt.com. Greg, let's get rolling right into it. The title of this show, as folks can see at the bottom, is NIL, How It Started and Where It Stands. I think where it stands was really laid out in an article you did on the baseball side, highlighting Jake Knapp and Aiden Hauk back in late August or mid-August. I think that that should be required reading for everybody that pays attention to college athletics, especially Carolina. If you haven't read it, go check it out. It's still on the website. But Greg, we are still evolving, but yet a far, far way away from where this all started, not too terribly long ago.
Yeah, for sure. And if you go back to the Jeremy Bloom, uh, congressional hearing, I guess 20 years ago now, one of the famous quotes coming out of that, as it pertained to the NCAA, is that they had never done much good policy wise unless mandated by the government, and that's pretty much what happened in June of 2021. Because if you go back to that time period, which is NIL, of course, started on July 1, 2021. But the reason it started then is that's the same day that a number of state legislatures across the country said, all right, we heard what the Supreme Court had to say in Austin. Now it's time for these players to be able to get a piece of the pie. And the NCAA was not ready for that. They had no choice. They had to abide by some of those states' rulings. And very early on, it was the Wild Wild West. There were three rules that the NCAA put into place for that initial interim policy. And it was pretty simple stuff. It was a matter of you can't pay players. That was the number one thing. Improper inducements. You can't pay somebody to come to a school. And then, of course, your compensation could not be for athletic participation. And that was it. That was everything on the docket. And then you had the component of universities could not actually participate in this. And so when we sat down with North Carolina's compliance department, in the weeks following that, what we found was that North Carolina had done a lot of work with Influencer and Compass in the years prior to kind of get North Carolina prepared for what was coming. But without a framework in place by the NCAA, you're still kind of trying to find the right avenue. And in terms of contracts, I mean, there really weren't any. There were agreements, and North Carolina really didn't have an idea of what their players had. The way compliance had it set up was there was an app, and whenever a player had an agreement for NIL, they took a picture of the agreement and they uploaded it to the app, and that just allowed compliance to take a look at it and say, okay, this meets the rules in place, both by the NCAA and by the university itself. And that was it. There was no tracking of how much money was in play. Nobody had an idea of what these contracts were paying at the time. I mean, even coaching staffs didn't have a full picture unless the players chose to share that information because it was private employment. And it was chaos, as as a number of people have said throughout the program. It was free agency without contracts, and so you had promises being made and that were not being kept. You had players who could step on campus and then change their mind last minute. So there was a lot of issues going on early on. The fact that universities were not able to get involved with a lot of this early on was also a problem because you saw a lot of different collectives kind of come up, and some collectives fell apart very quickly, very famously. And then you had other collectives not doing things by the books, which posed problems. And then, of course, at North Carolina, where there is an emphasis on doing things the right way, you had secondary break club for basketball, and then, of course, Hills for Life on the football side of things. But they were all kind of independent, and they couldn't actually work with the university. So there was a lot of moving parts. There was a lot of chaos involved. And basically, if you wanted to skirt the rules a little bit, which a lot of people did, you could really have some success. And so there were some programs who really benefited from that. And then you had schools like North Carolina who were intent on following the rules to the best of their ability. Were kind of on the getting shortchanged a little bit. Now, over the last 3 years, bit by bit, we have seen new rules and guidelines come into play. It's really benefited the entire framework. This is what should have happened from the get go, but because the NCAA is the NCAA, they weren't proactive enough in this. And so, unfortunately, we're 3 years in, and only now are we getting to the point where this is a good setup. It can get better and it will get better. But at least now we kind of have a foundation in place where it really is not the wild, wild west that it was just 3 short years ago.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about roster management and how you. I mean, was it even possible to do that when you had wide open transfer portal? Then those all come out. I, I've always felt like there needs to be one or the other. They don't need to be both. But to your point, they're starting to sort of get a little bit of a hand on it. And Greg, just to get it out there again for people, Carolina's been at the forefront of trying to do it, quote, the right way. They've put a lot of work in that aspect of it. Now, it's tough for fans to see that when you see guys, at other schools making a ton of money or whatever. But one thing about North Carolina, and I want your thoughts on this, is they've been really good at roster retention in the middle of all this, I think. Of course, you had some transfers out of the basketball program a couple of years ago, but football's been good about retention. Baseball's been really good. The article you wrote highlighted those two guys. But Carolina, talk to me about the Carolina leading the way. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but at least being up to speed on doing it correctly in what you called and what's absolutely true at the time was the Wild Wild West.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, Bubba Cunningham was really he saw this coming a number of years ago. Mac Brown has talked about how when he first got here, Bubba was coming in and talking to the players about, hey, this is kind of where we're going. We don't know what it looks like, but this is kind of the thought process. This is what we're going to try to do, and that's why I mentioned influencer and brander and some of these things that they were trying to use. Compass was the uh, administrative infrastructure that they use for student athletes to be able to share information. They had the whole launch program, which started the month before NIL came out. So there's been a lot of efforts in play. And then, of course, group licensing. That's the big thing, where they were the first ones. Carolina was the first ones across the country who came up with the concept of, hey, we're going to be more than just about the best player on the team. We're going to use this as an opportunity to get groups of people involved, maybe entire rosters, to be able to use their brand and to use their NIL to raise attention about the program, to bring them a little bit of funds, and so all these things are important. You mentioned there about some of the issues early on with like the transfer portal. That's a great example. If you remember back, I guess it was that fall of 2021, Carolina had people transferring, and they had people transferring the year before, like mid-season, they were entering the portal. And that was an issue because what was happening is you had kids who just didn't want to be at certain schools anymore. And maybe they were tempted by other schools, the whole bribing thing that Mac has talked about. And they would just get in the portal mid-season. And now as a coaching staff, you're like, well, I don't have the depth that I had to start the season, and the season's still going on. And it's difficult when you're trying to be principled to handle that type of dynamic. So now we're in a spot where you don't see that happen anymore because there are rules in place. You can only enter the portal at certain times. And so because Carolina has been so intent on playing by the rules, they've really built up this system where as the NCAA legislation continues to roll out, and we'll see even more of it once the House settlement deal comes through next year at some point. North Carolina is going to be well positioned because they have built this structure to play by the rules. And I know a lot of fans are like, you got to bend the rules to play with the big boys. That's just not how Carolina does things, and that's not how Carolina has ever done things. And I don't see anything to suggest that they will change. But now they're in a position where the way that they've built things and built this infrastructure, they are well positioned as we move ahead and as there's actually more rules and guidelines put into place to have success. And that's kind of a big component of this. Now, you mentioned retention. And I think this is where a lot of the contract conversation comes into play. As we said initially, it was free agency without contracts. Well, now we actually have contracts in place. Now that Carolina NIL has come together, Kevin Rice, who is executive director of North Carolina Hall of Fame, which is a part of the Carolina NIL structure, but he's also kind of in the same role with Oldwell Management, and that's the group that's doing a lot of these NIL deals, and he actually does the negotiation process. And so it's very unique how they have all these things set up, and kind of his intent and Oldwell's intent is to not wait necessarily into the end of a football season or end of a basketball season to start conversations. Their intent is to identify key players before the season starts, even during the season, and get those players locked up and get those players happy with whatever deals they've had. Marion Hampton's a big deal. Kamon Rucker, of course. You mentioned some of the baseball guys. RJ Davis is part of that. So there's a lot of work being done contractually to get these guys who the coaching staff wants locked up on these deals. And it's not just a 1-year deal. It can be a 2-year deal or whatever you want it to be. And there are buyouts included now, right? So it's not just a matter of another school coming in saying, "Hey, we're gonna offer you $500,000 more." Well, you can do that, but there's also penalties involved if you're trying to get out of it. And there's a lot of contractual obligations now that were not there 3 years ago. And so Carolina has done a really good job putting those types of principles and processes in place. And that's another indication that because they've really kind of nailed down this idea of what they want NIL to be at North Carolina, that they've had some success and keeping players that they want while also bringing some in as well.
Yeah, we're talking about Greg Barnes here on the next level, talking NIL, how it started, where it stands. Johnny T-shirt and Congruity, of course, of our sponsors. Greg, the contract aspect of it, and really, this is probably a later conversation we could have, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you about it because we've talked about it before. Gone are the days, not completely, but a good portion are gone are the days where the name brand of the school is the carrying factor in recruiting, in transfers. We saw that aspect of it with, North Carolina trying to get a center to replace Armando Bacot. I mean, it's not just come to Carolina and it's, Mac talks about the 40-year decision on the football side. That's still a thing, but this NIL has changed everything. The contracts that North Carolina uses, just your opinion on, yes, Carolina's got the structure and they're doing it the right way. Your opinion on how effective it is across the sports, because it feels like it's more effective in certain sports than it does in other sports. Am I just off there or am I getting somewhere?
No, for sure, and that's one of the benefits of Carolina NIL coming together the way it was, because you had a lot of different pieces. I mean, when you look at all the components of Carolina NIL, I mean, Oldwell Management is Secondary Break Club and Hills for Life coming together. So that's consolidation, which is good. You've also got North Carolina Hall of Fame. You've got Rams Club. So you've got different entities that are doing different parts of fundraising and all these kind of things for different stuff. And so there just wasn't a lot of unity and there wasn't the streamlining that you need. And so kind of a good example of that is Rams Club, of course, is scholarships and some facilities. That's primarily what they're raising money for right now. Well, Oldwell and Rams Club, they actually have a lot of conversation now. And it's really of like, okay, where should we focus efforts, even though they're kind of doing different things? What are some good fundraising strategies? So there's a lot of collaboration, and that hasn't been there in the past. And so you're starting to see a lot of benefits in regard to that, with all 28 sports having better success and being more streamlined in all these processes. There's different components to it. Does North Carolina maybe have the money of a Ohio State fan base, or maybe an Alabama fan base? Well, no. I mean, you look at the oil money in Texas, right, with A&M and the University of Texas. I think SMU is going to have a chance to have a lot of success in that regard. Can Carolina compete with those types of booster funds consistently? You would like to think so, maybe in the future. Right now, that's not the case. So by streamlining and by collaborating, you're kind of getting everybody on the same page. And one of the unique things, you mentioned the North Carolina brand. Okay. Yes, now that money is involved with NIL and with these contracts, you can't just say, hey, come to Carolina, we're special. It doesn't work that way anymore. This is a business transaction for a lot of these kids, especially a lot of these elite kids. And so while on one side, you're trying to raise money through the NIL process to really be able to distribute out and to have money through these contracts where, kids have various requirements, on their side, there's community engagement, there's sponsorship responsibilities from these contracts that they're signing with these commercial entities. You got to keep your grades up, all these different things that are kind of in play there. So there's that component, but there's also, for North Carolina with the brand, you have the for-profit side. And that's where a lot of the commercial licensing stuff comes into play. And that's one of the things that I think is really going to help North Carolina. And that's really going to drive some of the NIL funding for athletes, is the opportunity to come up with creative events. Kevin Rice, when he spoke with us a month ago, talked about the idea of there being event rollouts of like, hey, there's an opportunity for, if you get special practice access, maybe you get special seating with the team, different types of concerts, these types of things that are not driven by how much money you can raise for, certain deals. It's just whatever the market allows, right? I mean, if you have a top-notch band come in, Eric Church is a good example that he did a fundraiser, but you get people buying tickets to these things. Well, that's not necessarily fundraising. That's for profit. They're buying a service. And the same thing goes with some practice access and those types of things. So the North Carolina brand is very beneficial on that front, because Carolina has such a big fan base that's going to drive some funds. We're early in this process. Obviously, Carolina NIL just rolled out on August 1st, but a lot of that will be coming in the months to come, of unique opportunities where you can really utilize Carolina's brand that's really untapped right now. And that'll be very beneficial for a lot of these NIL efforts. And it kind of speaks to your point there about, it's not just the Carolina brand bringing kids in, but you can maximize that Carolina brand in terms of revenue to really offer the opportunity for all these different types of deals.
Yeah, and when you look at it, and you mentioned Ohio State and these other schools in the Power Two conferences, you're still taxing North Carolina donors, I think, to do both, to do this and to build things. Um, doesn't this all mean this ACC media contracts and all that? Doesn't it ultimately make this a more important thing for Carolina to get in a situation where they're at least on par that way with those other schools?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And here's the thing that people need to understand. Tennessee is a good example. Tennessee, when you look at their financial report, every school has to turn in a financial report to the NCAA. Tennessee, in their financial report, they list facilities as part of their expenses. Carolina does not. Carolina has to go that route through the Rams Club. And
That's a big deal.
It's a massive deal. And so what's happening is that the Big Ten and the SEC schools, because they're bringing in so much money from revenue, from TV money is that they're able to use that not just for coaching salaries and for staff and all these various expenses with travel and recruiting and food. They have enough money left over where they can dedicate some of those funds to facilities. And so now all of a sudden, when they go to boosters, they're like, well, you know what? Facilities are being covered by our TV deal. So what we really need from you is to maybe pitch in to help boost coaching salaries a little bit. Or primarily, it's for NIL now. So we need to sweeten that pot so we can bring in more guys and retain more guys that we want. That's how we compete nationally. Carolina's not in that position. Carolina's having to rely on donors for facilities and coaching upgrades and a lot of the coaching salaries and the Larry Fedora buyout, a lot of those things. And then in addition to that, you're saying, okay, we know that we've asked you for this and for this and this. Well, now we really need your support with NIL for us to be able to compete. And I think it's important that the coaching staffs, and we can kind of dive into this too, Tommy. The coaching staffs are a key part of this. Mac Brown came on our show in July and really talked about the importance of Carolina NIL, what was coming, and what was really necessary for the program to have success. I know some fans got a little frustrated with him, I guess, last year when he talked about the need to really elevate donations for NIL. But he's exactly right. If you want the team to compete at a national level and to really push for ACC championships, you need money in place for a lot of these NIL deals to take place. Scott Forbes, baseball coach, he's all into it. And granted, it's a little bit different for baseball because he's really trying to maximize the potential for money to come in to offset student debt. They only get 11.7 scholarships, and we're talking about a roster with 35 guys. Any additional money that those guys can bring in, that's allowing them to graduate and leave North Carolina without debt, which is such a big part of this whole equation that we don't talk about a lot. So Scott Forbes is entirely sold on this and really has done a lot to assist Oldwell and Carolina NIL. And he really wants to learn about it and try to elevate knowledge about it, especially throughout the fan base, to be able to help his players. And so that connection is very important as we talk about all this.
Yeah, it's like, okay, donor, I need you to give me some money so I can put your name on this building, but we also need a defensive tackle.
That's right.
And to your point a little bit earlier, you mentioned all 28 sports. This is a 28 sport phenomena here. Like they are soccer players getting paid. They are across the board. How is Carolina in position there to compete across the board like they want to? We talked about the Directors Cup before, and they finished high up the food chain again. But Greg, it all goes back to money, and it ultimately, to me, goes back to the media contracts. But Carolina's positioning there with being able to survive that as other schools that may not spend a ton on football, but they have a great women's soccer program, and they're going to pay young ladies to be a part of that. Where's Carolina there, in your opinion, and the challenge of not only funding, not only competing, but competing at the highest level across all of them?
Yeah, this is one of those topics, Tommy, that I think it's going to be downstream before we see the true ramifications of a lot of this. And we'll obviously have a show when the House settlement deal is finalized, or at least we have a lot more information than we do right now. But just looking at that, you're going to be looking at a lot more money going into scholarships for a lot of the Olympic sports, which creates a whole other issue in terms of funding, which is good for the players, but it makes it stressful for the athletic department. But one thing that Carolina, because Carolina has had a history of excellence in all these other sports, is that you have a strong support network through the former players and throughout those individual communities. And so a lot of these programs do a pretty good job of raising money on their own to kind of benefit. And one of the things with Carolina NIL is you can pick, as we've talked about before, You can pick where you want your money to go. So if you just want your money to go to Carolina basketball, men's basketball, you can do that. If you want to go just to football, you can do that. But a lot of the money that goes into Carolina NIL does not have these requirements attached. And so North Carolina is able to sit down and distribute money as needed. And I think that's just the thing of as we get further along and we start seeing the ramifications of the SEC and the Big Ten media deals, where they are bringing in so much more money and therefore they can spend more money on the Olympic sports. That is going to be a test. That is going to be a challenge. And so it's really just kind of building the infrastructure early on and letting it expand and letting it grow and really maximizing some of those for-profit opportunities I was talking about earlier to be able to benefit these other programs that maybe don't get the same media attention and the revenue streams that the football and men's basketball programs do.
Absolutely. Like we talked about when we did the money show, whenever it was, the finances are unbelievable. And football first, and then basketball carry the load for the entire university. NIL has become a huge part of that. Carolina's handling of NIL, Greg Barnes has always been on top of. Anything left for this one, Greg? I mean, I think it is phenomenal where it started and where it is now. I mean, I don't know, but the question is, where's it going to be in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? Is it even going to be recognizable to us sitting here now? Then, what do you think?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing with the House settlement deal is once if that plays out the way it's kind of looking at the moment, um, NIL may not be that big of a conversation anymore, right? It may just be paying players across the board, and that's a whole different conversation. And then maybe the Rams club gets involved on that end, and this could change dramatically. And that's Bubba made that point back in the spring, and some fans didn't really like the way he said it. But he's like, "What are the odds of all this looking the exact same in 5 years as it looks today?" Well, not very likely. And so you kind of just have to roll with the punches a little bit. One thing I did want to mention, Tommy, is we get some questions about coaching roles in a lot of this new NIL contract stuff. Okay. So in April, the NCAA loosened up regulations to allow university involvement. Okay. But head coaches, coaching staff still cannot get into the nitty gritty of negotiations. They're not permitted to do that. And so what you see is there's this relationship building that's very important that takes place between the basketball staff, the football staff, baseball staff, and Oldwell management. And Kevin Rice does, as I said, does a lot of those negotiations. That's I think right now maybe they've got 3 on staff. They're looking to probably expand that depending on how things play out here in the months to come. TJ's, of course, with Oldwell management now. And so what happens is there's a roster building conversation of like, okay, what does this staff want from a roster building perspective? If they could kind of fill out what holes they needed, what does that look like? And then there's conversations that continue to take place with players. At the end of the basketball season 10 years ago, Roy Williams would sit down with his guys and say, all right, look, I'm going to go to all my NBA people, talk to them about what they see in terms of your potential for being drafted, where you'd be drafted, and then I want to see exactly what you're looking for. If you want a guaranteed first round contract and you're not there, then let's talk about potential for you coming back and those types of things. Those conversations still take place. But now when you start talking about the contract negotiation side of things, once the coaching staff decides, okay, this is who we really want to focus on in terms of retention, this is who we really want to get out of the portal, then they go to OL management and say, all right, well, this is the conversation, this is the overview of what we're looking for in terms of roster building. And from that point forward, you put your priorities in place. And then Oldwell can start doing the negotiation process with the players, whether they be on the roster currently, whether they be in the transfer portal, even in the high school recruiting ranks. And so there's a a lot of communication that has to be built, and there's a lot of trust in play there. Kevin Rice joked that when he was going through the baseball contracts, after the end of the season before the MLB draft, he said, him and Scott Forbes probably talk to each other more than they talk to their wives. So it very much is like a professional general manager relationship with coaching staffs in terms of figuring out what do you want, what can we afford, where can we find money, how does this look, and if that communication is not taking place, then you're really leaving something on the table. And so Forbes has done a great job with that, really kind of pushing things. Mac Brown and Pat Suddas on the football side of things have really been vocal about the importance of these relationships and really creating the contract structure that's necessary to be able to get some kids in place. They know they're not going to be able to compete with pro teams in terms of what pro teams can pay. But what you want to do is supplement what North Carolina already offers. We all know what North Carolina offers in terms of academics and culture and just being on campus and having a good time with your teammates and your friends. And so all those things are very important. Now, that rule change for the university to be involved was put into place by the NCAA back in April. Hubert Davis hasn't spoken to the media since the end of the NCAA tournament, which was in March. And so we haven't been able to get Hubert's opinion on a lot of this like we have with Mac and some other coaches. So once he has his first media availability in the I assume weeks to come, he's going to get a lot of questions, I would assume, about name, image, and likeness and Carolina NIL and how all these things benefit his program and kind of his role in helping to facilitate a lot of this. Because as you know, Tommy, we've had a lot of discussion this offseason about where men's basketball maybe has struggled in getting the elite big guy that everybody thought they could get this offseason. And so there'll be a lot of conversation with Hubert and his staff about how NIL looks, how it affects them, and those types of things as we get into basketball season.
Yeah, you may not like it, you may not believe in it, but you better use it to your ability because everybody else is on the train going past you. NIL, Greg Barnes breaks it down simply and comprehensively for everybody to understand. Greg, we'll get together. How settlement will drop, we'll get together. We'll talk about that. We'll continue the Next Level series throughout the season, talking about these elevated topics that not only affect football or basketball, but everything in college athletics. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt. Go see them on campus or go see them on johnnytshirt.com and Congruity. Email matt@congruityhr.com for your free assessment for your small to mid-sized business. Greg, as always, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy.